He's the one who's made this possible tech-wise. Sure. We're doing this live without a net. First time trying this, so you guys are guinea pigs tonight. Appreciate your patience as we get some of those kinks worked out. We do have some folks that are zooming in to watch our presentation. Um, all of these sage Keith Richards once said that he and Mick Jagger argued all the time because they were brothers. He says, "We're not friends, mate. We're brothers, and brothers fight." Right? And I was like, yes. And I don't know if anybody here has a brother. I have a brother. And of course, we squabble all the time. And then we'd always be back. Like there's one person who's got your back. It's your brother. Right. And so that was, I thought, an ingenious way of looking at the founders who are posing for history in their funny socks and their buckle shoes and looking all grand and reminding us that they're like us. And so looking at their squabbles is a way to shed light and insight on major events of the founding. And among those founders, I found John Adams irresistible. He's got 8 main characters. And again, one of the genius things about that book is he's got a founding mother, Abigail Adams. He's got a founding grandfather, Benjamin Franklin. And he's got these great dynamics between all of them. And Adams is that one guy who can't pose for history the way the rest of them are trying to. Because everyone knows that history's watching, and Adams is like, but it didn't happen that way. And I got to tell you, and he'll tell you kind of what you need to hear versus what you want to hear. That was one of Jefferson's great genius talents, is he would tell you what you wanted to hear. Oh, yeah, right. Okay. And that's why Jefferson wins history versus Adams, who's going to tell you how it actually happened. And I just found this irresistible. And as Ellis is discussing Adams, he says that for Adams, the most meaningful kind of conversation was an argument. And this wasn't an argument for the sake of being contentious or argumentative. We have to remember that Adams is a lawyer, and what do lawyers do? They argue, they build a case, they create an argument, they provide facts, context, a structure. And so having an argument is a way to build that, as opposed to just having an opinion. And so that's why an argument was so meaningful for Adams. And I thought that would be a useful lens for me to kind of approach him as I decided I wanted to finally take a crack at writing about Adams. And, the nice thing about all of these founders is we can discover them for ourselves. And that's one of the takeaways I hope you have from tonight, is an invitation to go and meet these folks for yourself through their writings so that you can see, in many ways, despite their fancy socks and their buckle shoes, they're just like us. And so I wanted to look at this notion of argument, of squabbling, of context, with key folks that were in Adams's life through the Revolution. And so that's kind of what we'll talk about a little bit tonight. And as we go, we'll get to the Declaration of Independence, and it'll feel like that little scene in Monty Python where they go, "There was much rejoicing." Yeah. But there's going to be more story, because a lot of us forget the revolution goes on until 1782. And some of Adams's most important service happens after the Declaration. So even though we'll get there and you guys will all be like, "Oh, thank God he's done," we're going to have like about 10 minutes left still that we'll have to hit. We're going to be here about an hour and 10 minutes. If you get bored, feel free to nap. If I start talking about someone you don't like Thomas Paine, go get some coffee, come back when you want to. I won't be offended, okay? So our arc starts atop Munjoy Hill in Falmouth, Massachusetts, today Portland, Maine. It's a morning in August 1774, and John Adams is there with his old friend Jonathan Sewell. By all accounts, it's a beautiful morning. Adams writes about it as so. They're 172 feet above Portland Harbor, spread out before them, with the archipelago of Casco Bay spread out around the horizon, ships and boats passing among the islands. Beautiful, beautiful scenery, first thing in the morning. But there's a chill in the air that day, not because of the weather, but because of the rift between these two men. They are both attorneys. They're working the circuit throughout Massachusetts. Sewell is the attorney general for the colony. Adams, an attorney representing private clients. And they had been, once upon a time, so close that Sewell referred to Adams as brother. Indeed, Sewell said that Adams has a heart formed for friendship. It's one of the reasons I love him so much. And yet, by this point in their relationship, things had frosted. Adams wrote, 11 years ago, I thought him the best friend I had in the world, and I loved him accordingly. But at this moment, I look upon him as the most bitter, malicious, determined, and implacable enemy I have. God forgive him the part he has acted both in public and in private life. And in a perfect Adams postscript, he says, it may be possible that he says the same prayer for me. Adams and Sewell had met in 1758 as young lawyers establishing their practices in Boston. And as young attorneys making their way, Sewell is 7 years older, but they're running the same crowd. They've got the same friends. They've got the same mentors. They're even wooing sisters together. Jonathan is wooing Esther Quincy, and John is wooing Hannah Quincy. Jonathan will marry Esther. John will not marry Hannah, because the day he decides to propose, he gets together with Hannah and they're talking, the mood is set, and Jonathan and Esther burst into the room and spoil the mood. And John never has the chance to regain that opportunity. He later says that Jonathan and Esther saved him from a certain affirmative and a marriage that would have sentenced him to a life of being unable to support the marriage that he had entered into. A year later, Hannah will be engaged to someone else, which is fortuitous for us because it gives John the opportunity to get to know Abigail Smith, whom we'll hear from in just a bit. The 1760s are a tumultuous time in Boston. And I encourage you to come and hear Steve talk about that in just a few weeks. Without getting into all the gory details, there are a lot of taxes that Britain imposes, a lot of rules, a lot of regulations on trade, challenges to writs of assistance that impact Boston liberty. Eventually, British troops will be quartered in Boston houses. And as these events roil the waters, Adams and Sewell find themselves on divergent political paths. Sewell will become the attorney general for the colony, and even though professionally they'll start dueling through newspaper columns written under pseudonyms. They'll be in court cases against each other, one of them being John Hancock, who's a very wealthy merchant from Adams's hometown in Quincy, has his ship impounded and is accused of smuggling, and Sewell prosecutes the case. Adams defends him, and he does so well that Sewell has to drop the charges. And even though professionally these tensions really pull at these two men, they still try to maintain their friendship. One night, Sewell stops by Adams' house with a surprising offer over dinner. He's authorized to extend an invitation for Adams to take on the role of Advocate General for the Court of the Admiralty, which is an influential position that would put Adams in contact with all the most influential business people in the colony. Adams would be a made man. And yet he's like, let me think about it. He makes up his mind almost immediately, but he puts his friend off because he doesn't want to hurt his friend's feelings. And weeks pass, months pass. Sewell keeps saying, well, why not? Why not? And finally, Adams has to admit, I cannot take the job. I cannot take a position that would put my own personal beliefs in such antipodes with my professional obligations. And from there, the friendship begins to fray. And as those tensions build over the late 60s into the early 70s, these men find themselves on these opposite divergent paths. But the reason they're atop Munjoy Hill in that August of 74 is that Sewall's invitation, in the spirit of their former friendship, he's asked Adams to get together because Adams has been selected as one of 4 delegates to a proposed Continental Congress in Philadelphia, where delegates from the different colonies will get together and discuss their shared grievances. And Sewall doesn't want his old friend to go. You'll be on the wrong side of history, he tells him. You'll be branded a traitor. But Adams, at this point, has made up his mind. I have crossed the Rubicon, he tells him. Live or die, sink or swim, survive or perish with my country, that is my implacable determination. And they begin to discuss and debate. And we don't have a record of what that discussion was like. We don't know if someone lost their temper. We don't know if someone stormed off. We don't know if maybe together they went back in sullen silence to their lodging house. But we know at the end of it, Adams says, I fear we must part. And with a bleeding heart, I fear I say forever. But you may depend on this. This adieu is the sharpest thorn I have ever set my foot on. And the 2 men go their separate ways. Months later, when violence breaks out at Lexington and Concord, Sewall will have to abandon his house in Cambridge, go behind British lines in Boston, where he will be seeking shelter. He'll eventually go to Halifax, and then off to exile in Great Britain. And the British aren't all that happy with people who help them lose their colony, and he will lead a rather poor life. Adams will see him only once more, when he becomes minister to the court of St. James, the first ambassador to England. And he goes to see his old friend one day, not to rub it in, but just to see how his friend is doing. Adams, as it turns out, has turned out on the right side of history. And they have what Adams describes as a very pleasant, wonderful conversation. It lasts 3 hours. But as they leave, Adams can't help but notice the poor condition that his friend and his friend's family are in. And ever after, he will consider Sewall to be one of the casualties of the Revolution. So Adams does go off to Philadelphia with a delegation, Thomas Cushing, Robert Treat Paine, and his cousin Sam, who we all know from his great brewing today, right? Sam and John are not close. They're separated by 12 years. Sam's family is from Boston. That's where he was born. So they're separated by age and geography. They share a common great-grandfather, James Adams. But Sam is a great cultivator of talent. And when John sets up his law practice in Boston, Sam sees him as someone to keep his eye on. Now, he doesn't bring him into the inner circle of Sam's doings, the Sons of Liberty. He thinks it's useful to have someone outside who's got independence, known for his integrity, useful in that capacity. But the two find themselves very closely politically aligned. Sam's Sons of Liberty are the ones who lead the resistance to a lot of this British taxation and a lot of these British rules. Sam will rally people around the Liberty Tree near Boston Common. He later goes to say that mobs have their uses. And perhaps he does a lot to stoke the mob that confronts the British soldiers outside the Custom House in March of 1770. We don't know for sure, but we do know that he has a huge role in turning that incident into the Boston Massacre. The British just call it the incident on King Street. The Boston Massacre, though. Think about how sensationalistic that sounds and the propaganda value that has. One of the talents that Sam Adams cultivates is a silversmith named Paul Revere, who does an engraving of that massacre. He's got a print shop that sends out a lot of propaganda flyers. They use that print shop to create committees of correspondence that connect Boston with other communities throughout Massachusetts, where they can plan and plot strategies. And those committees of correspondence then stretch to other colonies and eventually lead to what becomes the Continental Congress. Perhaps Sam had something to do with the protest that led to the Boston Tea Party and the agitation of the crowd there. I say perhaps because we don't really know. Sam had an amazing talent for cultivating culpable deniability. And even though his fingers are pulling the strings on all these things, he doesn't leave his fingerprints anywhere. John talks about an instance where they're sharing a boarding house in Philadelphia during the Second Continental Congress, and Sam is throwing stacks of letters into the winter fire. And in the summer, using scissors to cut up letters into pieces smaller than atoms, atoms, that he can scatter out the window that can never be reassembled. And John says, well, why are you doing this? And Sam says, regardless of what happens to me, none of my friends shall suffer for my negligence. Sam is very politically astute. He's the sly fox, as even John Adams becomes the bull in the china shop, or more like the Clydesdale in the barber shop, because he's definitely a workhorse. But John gets a real political education from Sam. When the delegation gets to Philadelphia, they stay at a lodging house just outside of the city. Some of the Philadelphia Sons of Liberty come out and they talk to him, and they say there's been a letter writing campaign, and that the Massachusetts delegates have been labeled as firebrands, and they're here to talk about independence and get everybody fired up. Whatever you do, do not mention independence. The idea is as unpopular as the British taxes themselves. So the next morning, the First Continental Congress gavels itself into session. The first person to stand up to speak is Sam Adams. Everyone's expecting this firebrand to give a stem winder of a speech, and instead, he calls for a prayer that Providence might overlook the actions of the Congress, which immediately changes the tempo and the tone of the proceedings. And so John will follow Sam's lead as they go through not only the First, but the Second Continental Congress. John is really nervous about being there because he's not sure that he's up to the task. He's not sure any of them are up to the task, who has taken on the world's greatest empire before. But he says that if there's any place where people can learn to do this, it will be this nursery of American statesmen. Here are fortunes, abilities, learning, eloquence, acuteness equal to any I have ever met in my life. These are the all-stars from all the colonies who've come together. He's awed. But as Congress continues its discussions and debates, Adams discovers that all of these all-stars have to demonstrate that they are all-stars, and they have to show off. And there's a lot of sermonizing and bloviating and blah, 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 blah. There's so much wit, sense, learning, acuteness, subtlety, eloquence among 50 gentlemen, each of whom has been habituated to lead and guide in his own province, that an immensity of time is spent unnecessarily. The scales fall from his eyes. He realizes these people put on their pants one leg at a time, just like he does. And he leaves much more confident in his abilities. He will always be overshadowed by his cousin Sam, who will be called the famous Mr. Adams. And John's like, and I'm the less famous Adams, right? Okay. But to his credit, he never begrudges how famous Sam is, which is incredible, because if you read John's diaries and journals and letters, one of the central tensions of his life is his ego, his desire for recognition, his ambition. And it's constantly at war with this need for humility. He says that vanity is my cardinal vice, and he fights with it all the time. And yet he never begrudges Sam being more famous. He later says that without the character of Samuel Adams, the true story of the American Revolution could never be told. Now, as he's getting to know these other delegates, someone who makes a pretty important impression on him is a guy named John Dickinson. And Dickinson is a very prominent attorney in Philadelphia. He's come to prominence because he wrote a series of newspaper columns that became a pamphlet called Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. It becomes the best-selling pamphlet in the history of the colonies up to that point. And what Dickinson basically does in these pamphlets is says, these taxations are awful, they're unfair, we're having our liberties imposed upon. And he does it in a very homespun farmer voice, the kind of thing that folks can relate to. But he's anything but a homespun farmer. He comes from a plantation outside Dover, Delaware, which at that point was still part of Pennsylvania. He sets up a law practice in downtown Philadelphia, marries into a prominent family, which makes him instantly rich, and his law practice takes off, and that's kind of what puts him into the political circles. And so he comes to the First Continental Congress with a very high reputation, except Adams is just like, this is the guy. He's a shadow, tall but slender as a reed, pale as ashes. One would think at first sight that he could not live a month. But he has an excellent heart, and the cause of his country is near it. But when the Congress, everybody goes home, they reconvene the beginning of May of 1775. And John realizes that John Dickinson has a much more conservative bent than he had the first time. And he's preaching reconciliation with Great Britain. And Dickinson's wondering, why is Adams so bellicose? Why are the New Englanders talking about independence at all? We should be making up with the mother country. And Dickinson says, if you New Englanders continue in your ways, there'll be blood on your heads. Except by this time, there's already been blood on Lexington Green and by the Old North Bridge in Concord and along the Battle Road back to Boston. There is already blood. The weapons of war have changed from pen to sword, Adams says. And so they're pushing for independence because he feels like they have crossed the Rubicon. He'd personally crossed his own Rubicon, but now the war itself is open war. And at one point he gives this, very passionate speech on the floor of the Congress talking about the need for independence. Afterwards, he has to quietly excuse himself, and Dickinson charges after him in a haughty and aggressive manner, Adams says, and he wrangles him out in the lobby. And he goes after Adams as though Dickinson were the schoolmaster and Adams were the pupil. And Dickinson says, if you New Englanders continue to oppose our pacific ways, then I and some of my fellows shall go on our own way and carry on the opposition ourselves. Adams supposedly keeps his cool, but he says, I will not be threatened. This tension is able to kind of come down a few notches because the army around Boston writes to the Congress asking for help. And the Congress decides to adopt the army as a continental army. John Adams takes that opportunity to nominate George Washington, a tall Virginian militiaman, to lead that army, figuring that it should look as though a Virginian is at the head of this, truly making it a continental army and getting buy-in from the largest, biggest, wealthiest colony. So Washington goes off to Boston, gets himself an army. And because of this, the New Englanders are backing off their opposition to reconciliation. And Dickinson is then able to draft what becomes known as the Olive Branch Petition. And they send off this letter to the king, sucking up, saying, hey, we're sorry. And Adams thinks this is futile. And George III proves it so. He not only doesn't accept the petition, he doesn't even read it. And he declares the colonies in open rebellion. So as all this is going on, John's writing to his friends. And in one letter, he describes Dickinson as a piddling genius whose fame has been trumpeted so loudly, who's given a silly cast to our whole doings. And the letter gets intercepted by the British and published in a pro-British newspaper in Boston. And word finally gets down to Philadelphia by September that Adams has said this. So as Adams is walking down the street one day, Dickinson's coming the other way, and Adams sees him, and he bows and takes his hat off, and Dickinson walks haughtily by. That's a word Adams uses with Dickinson a lot. And Adams says, well, I was determined to make my bow to get his mood. Apparently, we are not to be in bowing or speaking terms for the time. They'll remain cordial in debate on the floor of Congress, but the friendship is gone forever. As all this is going on, John is an incredible letter writer, but he's writing particularly to his wife, Abigail, back home through 74, 75, into 76 and beyond. Abigail was anxious for him to take this appointment. She said, I long for you to be on the national stage. And she encourages him to go. He's a lawyer. He's riding the circuit. She's used to him being away from home. What could it hurt? Go to Philadelphia, be gone a month and a half, right? Little does she know that their separations will be measured in years, not months or weeks. Over the course of their marriage, they will be apart more than a quarter of the time. And if you read their letters back and forth, they're both anxious about this. And she recognizes his call to national service, his call to duty. He still feels this duty to his family, and he wants to be there. And he suffers a lot of physical ailments because of the stress that comes from this. And she characterizes this separation as her form of national service. And I think rightly so. Because at any time she could have said, enough, John, come home. And he would have. And he'd have been miserable. And she knows this about him. So she lets him do this because she knows her husband. She knows the sacrifices they're both going through at this time. And it's heartbreaking to read some of those letters between the two of them because, their marriage produces 6 children. They have 2 daughters who die in infancy. John's trying to parent from Philadelphia and offer advice. And he knows this is the time these kids need their dad. And yet I have to be here. And she lets him. And it, to me, is a remarkable dynamic. And we should be grateful that she lets him because there would be no John Adams if Abigail said no. He gets to be who he is because of her support. And she stays home and runs the farm and takes care of the kids and does everything that her husband should be home doing, as they both say in their own letters. The two of them first met when John was wooing Hannah Quincy. So his eyes are full of those stars. So he doesn't have a very favorable impression of Abigail, who's 10 years younger and thinks that she's too mouthy and too opinionated. But when he meets her again 2 years later, he has a much different impression. He describes her company as a constant feast, tender, feeling, sensible, friendly, a friend, not an imprudent, not an indelicate, not a disagreeable word or action. Prudent, modest, delicate, soft, sensible, obliging, active. We don't know what her first reaction is, lost to history, but we know they start spending an awful lot of time together. After a long courtship of nearly 2 years, they get married. They move into a house that John had inherited from his father. And he says to her, as he embarks on this public service, I must entreat you, my dear partner, in all the joys and sorrows, prosperity and adversity of my life, to take part with me in the struggle. And I think that's a key line from him because the two of them did look at each other as equals. He was enlivened and attracted by her personality. She wasn't formally educated, but her father was a minister. He encouraged her to read widely, taught her French. And so in conversation, she was just absolutely marvelous. And John loved that about her. And she was really pretty. And Abigail found him attractive because he appreciated how smart she was at a time where men did not value that in most women. And throughout their whole marriage, they would be equal partners. He would write to her, advise me on this, tell me about that. When he's vice president, he tells her, I cannot do a thing without you. And ironically, we know so much about their marriage because they spend so much time apart. They're writing these letters. It's when they're together, they're not writing to each other. We can't read their mail. But because they're apart, we get to read the mail. I want to just focus on their most famous bit of correspondence. I got to take out my old man reading glasses here, so you'll pardon me for a moment. But I want to make sure I get this right. This comes on a letter written on March 31st, 1776. And I encourage you to go read their letters for yourself because they're all available. Abigail's a wonderful correspondent. Her letters are chatty. They're full of all sorts of news. John's a little more circumspect. He's worried his letters are going to get intercepted. So this letter comes from March 31st. This is Abigail. In the code of the new laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire that you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. That your sex are naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established as to admit no dispute. She urged him instead to willingly give up the harsh title of master for the more tender and endearing one of friend. So John gets this. He writes back, as to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. We have been told that our struggle has loosened the bands of government everywhere, that children and apprentices were disobedient, that schools and colleges were grown turbulent, that Indians slighted their guardians, and Negroes grew insolent to their masters. But your letter was the first intimation of another tribe more numerous and powerful than all the rest that were grown discontented. This is rather too coarse a compliment, but you are so saucy I won't blot it out. Depend on it, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems. Although they are in full force, you know they are little more than theory. We dare not exert our full power in its full latitude. We're obliged to go fair and softly. And in practice, you know we are the subjects. We have only the name of masters. And rather than give up this, which would completely subject us to the despotism of the petticoat, I hope General Washington and all our brave heroes would fight. Now, some historians have criticized Adams for what seems like a patronizing response, where he's sort of poo-pooing and dismissing what he has to say. But I think that misses the point of their full relationship and the full context of their correspondence, where they saw each other as equals and they had a sense of humor, where they're always going back and forth. He tells her she's being saucy. And that's a really vibrant part of their correspondence. At one point, later on in their correspondence, she says something about how he's 60 years old. And he's like, oh, you're so saucy. If I were there, I'd show you I'm not a man more than 40. You know, I mean, like they had that relationship. And so he's taking what she's saying in the vein of good humor that they have. So she responds, I cannot say I think you're very generous to the ladies, but whilst you're insist upon retaining absolute power over what? You must remember that arbitrary power is like most other things that are very hard, very liable to be broken. And notwithstanding all your wise laws and maxims, we have it in our power to not only free ourselves, but to subdue our masters, and without violence, throw both your natural and legal authority at your feet. And John lets her have the last word. He knows that, yes, they're joking, but they're kidding on the square. She's serious too. And he says in his final response here, among all the disappointments and perplexities which have fallen to my share in life, nothing has contributed so much to support my mind as the choice blessings of a wife, whose capacity enabled her to comprehend and whose pure virtue obliged her to approve the views of a husband. This has been the cheering consolation of my heart. In my most solitary, gloomy, and disconsolate hours, in this remote situation, I'm deprived in a great measure of this comfort, yet I read and read again your charming letters, and they serve me in some faint degree as a substitute for the company and conversation of the writer. He's delighted that she challenges him and says, like, look, you got to pay attention here. Now, the reason that they're talking about these laws that the new government must form is it's, getting into the spring of 1776. It's a big discussion in the Congress about what's going to happen. And independence has suddenly become more popular. And as that has happened, Congress begins to debate the idea of having each colony establish its own government, breaking free from the colonial connections. And in May, they pass a resolution doing so, a resolution that Adams himself writes. And he knows this is a de facto Declaration of Independence, because once the colonies take that power for themselves, there is no going back. Well, of course, people are like, well, what should these governments look like? And other delegates begin asking John. And so he starts writing out responses. He does a series of 4 letters to other delegates about here's what these governments should look like. This has been very much on his mind because he's had to do some of this writing for the colonial legislature in Massachusetts. And it's on his mind because of the publication in January of, well, there's Abigail. I'm sorry. Until I never use PowerPoints. I'm sorry. The publication in January of a pamphlet called Common Sense. And we remember Common Sense today because it has this huge thunderclap effect of shifting public opinion in favor of independence. It's written by 37-year-old Thomas Paine, a recent immigrant from England. He's kind of down on his luck. He shows up in Philadelphia, gets a job writing for newspapers in Philadelphia, starts writing political tracts. That's kind of what gets him into the political scene in Philadelphia. And he starts writing this pamphlet, which is published in January, which just absolutely crazy. It outsells anything ever written. It makes Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer look like a feeble attempt at publication. And the reason it is so popular is because he lays out the case for independence in a way that everybody can understand. Because up to this point, all the delegates and lawyers and hoity-toity folk are really speaking the language of the courthouse, whereas Paine writes, as one historian says, in the language of the public house. A couple guys getting together over beers talking about this stuff. And he says things like, what sense is it? How long can it last for a continent to be ruled by an island? And people are like, oh, yeah, right. And so it really catches on. And Adams thinks it's brilliant. He calls it a phenomenon. And he says its ideas about independence I like very much. But the longer he spends with Common Sense, the more it troubles him, the more problematic it becomes. And we remember this PR value of Common Sense, but half of it is actually about like, what do we do once we declare independence? And it sort of lays out Paine's ideas for government. But Paine doesn't know anything about political science. He doesn't know anything about government. And so it's sort of like the armchair quarterback telling the Hall of Famer, hey, you should do this. And so Adams really starts to worry about the effect that will have on the public opinion. So he decides he's going to counteract that. So that's where these letters come from that he starts writing to other delegates. Richard Henry Lee of Virginia likes his letter so much, he asks Adams for permission to publish it. And Adams says, sure. They publish it anonymously because, of course, it's treason, but it's a pretty open secret that it's Adams that writes it. And maybe you've not heard of Thoughts on Government, but I'm sure some of it's going to be familiar to you. Let me grab a drink here real quick. First of all, 3 independent branches of government. An executive that has departments in charge of carrying out the laws. The laws are made by the legislature, which will have 2 houses, a large common House of Representatives and a smaller, more select chamber. The 2 shall serve as checks and balances against each other. And a 3rd independent branch of the judiciary. Sound familiar? We tend to think of James Madison as the father of the Constitution. But the plan Madison puts forward doesn't look a whole lot like the final product. Instead, that final product looks a lot like the Constitution of Virginia, which was very much influenced by George Mason, who was very much influenced by Thoughts on Government. In fact, 8 of the colonies create governments that look just like what John Adams lays out. Ironically, one colony that doesn't is Massachusetts. They're all still upset with each other and still kind of going through lots of turmoil. So a couple of years later, Adams will be asked to write their constitution. He'll sit down and spend a couple of weeks in his front office. You can go there today and stand next to the desk that he used to write that with. And he becomes the longest serving, still active constitution in the world. And these constitutions become this template for how we should carry on. Nothing John Adams writes will, and is voluminous, correspondence and letters and everything he writes, nothing will be as impactful as thoughts on government. We're living that today. So things are really moving at a super speed at this point. The independence movement's really picking up a lot of momentum. And this is where Thomas Jefferson comes into our story just in time to become immortal. Okay? He was sent to the Continental Congress because he wrote a pamphlet that made him famous throughout Virginia that laid out the rights of British colonials. But he doesn't really want to be in Philadelphia. He wants to be where the action is in Williamsburg. They're like, we need you up there. We need you up there. He gets there, doesn't make a big splash. Adams remembers that he hardly said more than 3 sentences together at any one time, but it's in committee work and in private conversation that Jefferson shines. And Adams takes a real liking to him, discovers that they're on very much the same page. And so by August of 1775, Jefferson goes home and he stays home and he's not there through all of this debate and discussion in 1776 until the middle of April. He comes riding in his liveried coach, just in time to start hearing the discussions about a resolution for independence. In June, the question gets put forward by a fellow Virginian, Richard Henry Lee. Gets tabled. John Dickens is super excited. Tabling this, we don't want to talk about it. But they only table it so that delegates can get instructions from their home legislatures about how to vote on this. But while they're doing that, why don't we get some guys together to write a Declaration of Independence so that if we do vote for it, we kind of have something to say. And so a committee is formed with John Adams as chair. Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, who's a cobbler from Connecticut, and Robert Livingston from New York, who's one of the conservatives put on the committee as a concession. And they get together and they have this debate. Well, who should write this? Well, Franklin, you're one of the most famous writers in the world. You write these quaint little aphorisms from Poor Richard's Almanac. You write it. And Franklin's like, I have resolved to never write anything that will be edited by committee. Okay. So then it's like, well, Adams, you do it. You've written a lot. And Adams is like, no, Jefferson, you do it. And if you hear Adams' side of the story, they go back and forth. And Jefferson says, well, why should I do it? And Adams says, I got 3 reasons. 1, you're a Virginian, and it should appear as though a Virginian is at the head of this thing. Sounds familiar. 2, I'm obnoxious and disliked. And there will be people who vote against it just because I wrote it. Now, that phrase, obnoxious and disliked, actually comes from the musical 1776. No one in Congress at the time describes Adams as obnoxious. The only one who does is Adams himself, writing years later, kind of looking back at his glory days and characterizing himself as obnoxious. And he says to Jefferson, you're 10 times the writer than I am. Now, if Jefferson's side of the story is like, they told me to write it, I said, okay. All we know is that Jefferson cloisters himself into his apartment on Market and 6th Streets for 3 weeks, and he comes back on June 28th with a Declaration of Independence. He does consult with Adams and Franklin on revisions. We can see Adams's handwritten changes on Jefferson's original document. We are endowed by our creator with unalienable rights. That's a John Adams edition. So on July 1st, Congress is going to take this up. Adams writes to a friend in Georgia, the great momentous question will be decided today. And as he walks to Independence Hall, storm clouds are gathering. But he sees sunny skies. They've been talking about this for months. He sees easy passage. The Congress gavels itself into session. They take care of a few bits of business, and then they can organize themselves into a committee of the whole so that they can discuss this draft, this resolution, excuse me. And the first person to rise is John Dickinson. And Dickinson says, I know that my already too diminished reputation shall suffer for what I am about to say. But he cannot allow his conscience to pass without speaking against independence. And he gives an eloquent speech that is so powerful, even Adams is impressed. He's got notes. We still have those notes. He goes through everything that they've been talking about, sums it up with his powerful legal intellect. And at the end of 2 hours, he sits down, exhausted, gaunt. It has taken a physical toll on him. Even as he does, the thunderclouds outside begin to rumble. I know that sounds like a terrible novelist's conceit, and yet it's true. Rain begins to patter against the tall windows of the room. And everyone looks around, waiting for someone to rise to their feet to answer Dickinson. Adams himself, hoping someone else will answer the call. But everyone knows he's been the leading voice for independence. He is the one to stand up and speak. I think he shows a little bit of false modesty when he was like, I was hoping someone less obnoxious would do it. But eventually he rises to his feet. And he speaks extemporaneously for 4 hours with such eloquence. And I use that word eloquence because delegate after delegate talks about Adams's eloquence. Jefferson himself says that he spoke with such force of idea that he moved us from our seats. He was our colossus on the floor. Partway through his argument, the New Jersey delegation comes in. They're like, what did you say? Could you repeat that again? And he does. And then he finally sits down. And after all of that, there are still 4 colonies holding out. Delaware, they have 3 representatives. One's for, one's against. The other one's homesick. Pennsylvania, of course, John Dickinson is not going to let his delegation vote. It's a 5-member delegation. 3 are opposed, 2 are in favor. New York doesn't have instructions, so they don't know what to do. And South Carolina, but they say, in the interest of unanimity, we might be convinced to change our minds to a yes if someone else does too. So that night at City Tavern, in the lodging houses, there's horse trading, conversation, persuasion, argumentation. And the next day, they come back together. In the meantime, someone has gone all the way to Dover, Delaware to get Caesar Rodney, who's home. Rodney rides through the thunderstorm overnight. 50
I'm watching something.
Show up.
What are you saying?
Gavels itself in for session.
What kind of beef?
He switches the delegation from Delaware.
I'm going to make myself a cream peas and jelly sandwich.
Also, the New York delegation says, we still don't have instructions, but we will not vote no. So they're going to abstain in the interest of unanimity. Well, that's enough for the South Carolinians to say, we shall vote yes too. But most notably, the Pennsylvania delegation votes yes. One of the no's, James Wilson, switches to a yes, and noticeably, 2 of the delegates have absented themselves, including John Dickinson, who could not bring himself to vote yes, but knew the value of unanimity. And so he intentionally stays home so that the delegation can vote yes. It becomes a unanimous vote in favor of independence. New York eventually gets instructions and they change the record to say yes too. It's a couple of weeks late, but they say yes too. So now it's time to bring up Jefferson's declaration. And Jefferson sits in the corner next to Ben Franklin, sullen, moody, not saying anything, as everyone debates every word, every phrase, every sentence, every paragraph. And it's just like, you're editing my stuff. Franklin's jabbing with him a little bit, telling him jokes, but it's Adams who will stand up and defend every word, every phrase, every sentence, every paragraph. He becomes the champion of the Declaration. Congress strikes about a quarter of it, but on the afternoon of July 3rd, they pass it, gets sent off to be printed, and on July 4th is the first public reading of the Declaration of Independence. Now, Adams is pretty excited about this. He says, I'm apt to believe that Independence Day will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of the continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore. but he was talking about July 2nd when they voted for independence. And this is how, again, Jefferson wins history, because people celebrate the 4th of July when the Declaration was approved and read. And Adams understood, like, for all his powerful oratory, those words were lost and gone. But here there's a written declaration, Jefferson telling us what we want to hear. And so Adams is right in spirit, if wrong in detail. And this is why he has a long, frustrating relationship with Jefferson. We'll talk about that as we wrap up here in just a second. Okay? But one of the delegates from New Jersey says, it was Adams who sustained the debate, and by the force of his reasoning, demonstrated not only the justice, but the expediency of the measure. The man to whom the country is most indebted for the great measure of independence is John Adams. I call him the Atlas of Independence. Now, this is that part of the program where everyone's thinking like, whoo, Declaration's over, we can be done, right? Okay. Got 10 more minutes to go because, of course, as the Declaration is getting passed, the British are landing troops on Staten Island. The Declaration is a sheet of paper that means nothing if the British just start marching around and shoving that piece of paper in people's faces, right? So there's got to be some military victory. So I spend a little bit of time talking about Adams's relationship with George Washington. And it's very complicated. I won't get into all the details tonight, but Adams is very loyal to Washington. Privately with Abigail, he sometimes questions Washington's leadership and some of his decisions, but publicly and with everybody else, he shows nothing but unwavering support. This is probably best exemplified during the early days of Washington's presidency, when the Senate is debating what should we call the new president of the United States. And John Adams is the vice president. He has just been for years in Europe, in the courts of Europe, and he's familiar with the language of diplomacy. And he thinks that the president should have some highfalutin title like they do in Europe. So he proposes some protector and lord of the United States and protector of its liberty, blah, blah, blah. And the people in the Senate just don't want anything to do with that. And Adams really pushes the point. And because he's really in favor of some fancy title, the senators start calling him his rotundity because he's a little chubby, right? And they end up settling on just calling him His Excellency the President. But this puts Washington off a little bit. He doesn't trust Adams's judgment. And so that's going to kind of create a rift between the two of them during Washington's presidency. But because Adams is chair of the Board of War for Congress, the day before he's put in charge of this Declaration Committee, he's put in charge of this new Board of War, which is basically the War Department for the Congress. He's the chair. He's basically our first Secretary of War. He's in charge of all the logistics, making sure all the stuff gets to the Army that needs to happen. And so he sees the need for some sort of firm guiding hand because the colonies don't have to do anything they don't want to. And there's got to be a lot of cajoling and a lot of forcing and just a lot of And this is really kind of what turns Adams into a Federalist, believing in a strong federal government. That's what turns Washington into a strong Federalist, because as a general, he sees the need for that firm guiding hand. Whereas Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, those guys are on the state level, theory, politics, yes, and they kind of believe in that more decentralized government. But Adams knows he's always going to be outshined by Washington because one gets martial glory through success on the battlefield. And Washington has a spotty record, but he's a soldier. And I'm one of those people who thinks you can't say enough positive things about Washington. Phil will get into this in a couple of weeks, actually. He does so much through his force of character, his honor, his sense of integrity. I don't think, realize just how important the precedents were that he set that really did a lot to hold us together as a nation in those early days, in the early years. And so Adams knew he'll never be able to compare to that. See, oh, look, I started talking about Washington. Ashley's like, I don't like this guy. I'm leaving. I'm going for Carr. And Adams is okay with that until his post-presidential years, and people start really kind of talking about how awesome Washington is, but don't also give Adams credit. And that's the one thing he wants. He like, I did something too. And he gets really upset about that. I think the real poke in the eye comes when his oldest son, John Quincy Adams, names his first son George Washington Adams because George was a very strong patron of John Quincy's diplomatic career. And so John Quincy really looked up to Washington a lot. Boy, that really miffed Abigail. She let John Quincy have it about that. It also bothered John. He never said anything to John Quincy that we know of, but Abigail certainly did. Their second son is named John Adams after their father. But Adams says, like, when the history of the revolution is written, it's going to be as though Ben Franklin took his electric rod, smote the ground, and outsprung Washington. And between the two of them, they conducted all of the warfare, diplomacy, and politics of the revolution. And that'll be it. It's kind of how we sort of remember a little bit, right? And Jefferson writing the Declaration. And that finally brings us to our last figure, probably the most famous man in America, Ben Franklin. He's late to the cause of independence, in part because he was publicly humiliated by King George III in a public dressing down. So he comes back to America and he's like, hey, guess what, guys? I'm a patriot now. And so he's there for the Continental Congress. He's there part of the committee that creates the Declaration. Adams works with him there. And because he's so famous, Adams is a little starstruck. But if you've spent any time studying Ben Franklin, looking at Ben Franklin, or anything about Ben Franklin, he is one of the most carefully curated public figures in American history. He writes his own autobiography, and he's very careful about the stories he tells about himself. And look how homespun I am in my little spectacles, and I'm inventing lightning with my kite, and I got a coonskin cat. And he just creates this very homey persona of himself that has gone down through history. And Adams believes it, just like everybody in America believes it. But it's when they go to Europe and start working together as diplomats that Adams starts to see behind the curtain. Franklin gets sent there first in order to try to convince France to come into the war. And the diplomatic mission over there is kind of a hot mess. And so Adams is sent over there to replace one of the commissioners. And he discovers like paperwork's just all over the place. The counts aren't balanced. And Franklin is going to parties all the time. And he's just sitting in the corner with his hands on his lap going, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then he'll say something in French and butcher the French. And everyone will be like, oh, he's so cute. Oh, right. And Adams discovers like Franklin doesn't speak French. That's why he's not saying anything. And so all of this stuff starts revealing itself. And Adams just gets aghast because the curtain is falling down and like, Franklin's just sort of being a ladies' man about town. And like everyone's Franklin's friend. They think he's a great friend to humanity. And it just infuriates Adam because he sees behind the curtains, like Franklin's sleeping in, he's out partying, he's not doing. And then there's actually a professional rift between the two because Franklin believes in what's known as the diplomacy of deference. We need the French's help, so let's just take whatever they'll give us, right? And Adams is like, no, like we need troops, we need men, we need material, we need support, we need their help. We got to ask them for this. We got to push them for this. And Franklin's like, no, we'll just take what they'll give us and let's kiss their butts. And it causes a real problem. And eventually, Franklin will have Adams recalled, and Adams will instead go to The Hague in the Netherlands. He'll negotiate some very important loans that help finance the American War. And while he's there, 1782, he gets an urgent letter from a guy named John Jay from New York, who's been sent to Europe to help negotiate a peace treaty with England. England is ready to throw in the towel. This is 2 years after Yorktown. Finally, Britain is ready to capitulate. And Jay writes to Adams and says, you got to get over here because Franklin wants to give away the store to France. And I need your help. And so Adams rushes over to Paris. And so they're going to negotiate independently of France to sign a peace treaty with Britain. Turns out Franklin actually agrees. And so he's going to kind of back their efforts. And the Treaty of Paris gets signed. There we can see John Adams sitting there next to Ben Franklin, John Jay standing over his shoulders. The British representatives never showed up to have their paintings, their portraits painting, because nobody wants to be remembered for surrendering Britain, right? And so they have this very contentious relationship, and Adams holds Franklin in contempt almost for the whole rest of his life. Franklin's judgment of Adams sort of gets passed down. He says, he means well for his country, is always an honest man, often a wise one, but sometimes and in some things, absolutely out of his senses. Adams called Franklin the great conjurer, creating this image that people believed and that there was little substance behind it. Yes, he was a great wit. Yes, he was a talented writer, but a great philosopher, a great thinker, maybe not so. So Adams, after the war, he'll go on to serve as the first ambassador to Great Britain. He'll get elected first vice president, serve under Washington for 8 years, have his own presidency for 4. Those tumultuous times of the 1790s, extremely contentious. If you think our politics today are divided, go read a newspaper from 1794, okay? But that divide really creates a breach between Adams and Jefferson, who had worked closely together in Europe. But they find themselves on opposite ends of the political spectrum. And by the time Adams is ousted from office, not reelected, he goes home through what I call his grumpy old man years. He's very bitter. He tries to explain, and it takes him a long time to get over it. But in 1811, he and Jefferson reconnect. And at first, it's a very hesitant sort of, how you doing? I'm fine. Hey, I've never held any ill feelings. Hey, neither did I, And so they're really just sort of feeling each other out as these old great statesmen. Well, Jefferson, I've always loved him. I've never felt bad. And as they start corresponding between Quincy, Massachusetts and Charlottesville, Virginia, partway through that correspondence, Adams finally just, because he can't hold himself in, right? He says to Jefferson, we should not die until we've had the chance to explain ourselves to each other. And so then they begin not only writing to each other, but to history, to us. And I urge you to go and read their letters for yourselves, because they start to spell out the differing views of what independence meant, what liberty means. Conversations we are still having today. I think that's the genius of the founding, is they institutionalize the debate and the discussion so that we can have it today. And the time that discussion breaks down, we have civil war, which is a great reminder why we should not give up on the discussion. The discussion is the point. And these two never come to a resolution, but they lay it out for us to be in touch with today. And we can read those words ourselves. They continue that correspondence till the day they died, which is literally the day they both died. So there's July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Now, if I was a novelist and I wrote this, you would never believe this coincidence. But they both are kind of in poor health, Jefferson more so than Adams. Adams has a pretty precipitous decline. On the 3rd of July, Jefferson really sort of collapses and he fades in and out of consciousness. Always conscious of the appearances on the morning of the 4th, Jefferson wakes up long enough to say, is it the 4th yet? Because he wants to die on cue. Right? Meanwhile, in Quincy, John's sitting in his chair on the 3rd, and he just suddenly kind of collapses and they get him into bed. And throughout the 4th, he's just weakening and weakening. And in the afternoon, he finally looks at his family gathered around him and he says, Thomas Jefferson survives. He knew on his deathbed that Jefferson would win history. Jefferson survives. He had no way of knowing that Jefferson had passed away hours earlier. Fading in and out of consciousness in his bed, across his study was a bust of John Adams, looking down on Jefferson as he drew his last breath. Thank you. Anybody have any questions? It's like, no, my God, he said an hour and 10 minutes. So I'd be glad to stick around and chat with you if anybody has any questions. I have copies of the book for sale if anybody's interested in that. Last thing I want to, I need to thank folks at home. Thank you very much for your patience. Lovely to have it. Oh, we have two questions from folks at home. Very good. All right. Rye, can you read those to us first? Virtually everything he decided, she offered opinions on. Alex, would you be kind enough to pass those off, please? Um, and she had unerring political instincts, and he tended to do worse in office when she wasn't there to advise him. And she would be back in Quincy, and he would be in New York. The one place that she kind of has questionable judgment is with the Alien and Sedition Acts. Those were acts that were passed that it remain controversial today. It's probably the low point of Adams's professional career. They were designed because there were French agitators who were agitating against the United States government in favor of the French Revolution. Adams is trying very hard to keep America out of war with France. And so the Alien and Sedition Acts were intended to punish people who were trying to basically get America into those. They're also they punish free speech, and of course, the rules are still getting made up. So we think of the First Amendment. I'm a First Amendment guy. I teach in journalism school. The First Amendment really important. They're still making those rules up back then, and so there is some question about are they legal or not? Today they obviously seem not, but at the time there was still some question about that. So that's an instance where Abigail gave him some bum advice, but otherwise she was instrumental in everything that he did. Good question. So the question is, Adam said that there was 1/3 of the population that was in favor of independence, 1/3 that was in favor of the British, and 1/3 that was sort of neutral. Is that really kind of a reflection of public opinion toward the French Revolution? French Revolution comes along later, and the public is pretty divided 50-50 on that. So you have like the Jeffersonians who are very pro-French because they see that as an extension of the American Revolution. The French Revolution goes off the tracks in some pretty awful ways. And even Jefferson later on says to Adams, like, you're kind of more right about that than I was. But that's its own sort of complicated thing. Depending on where you were in any of the colonies, public opinion was more than just 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Around New York, there was a significant pro-British faction that made Washington's occupation of Long Island and Manhattan very problematic, for instance. South Carolina, there's this belief that if the British get into the upcountry, there's going to be this upswell of pro-British support, and they don't find it anywhere. So it really kind of depends on where you're at as far as what those attitudes were. So the 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 is kind of a convenient, easy way to explain it, but it really gets more complicated, as history typically does. So, yeah. Thank you all very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.